If you've just joined us live, allow yourselves to settle and arrive. We'll begin in 1 minute. Okay, good. We are ready, folks. One more recording. Yizat Hashem. Okay, Tov Ma'od. Baruchim Aba'im, welcome to Awakening, Torat Mussar Mindfulness. I am Rabbi Chasya Uriel Steinbauer, the founder and director of Founder Director Rabbi Chasya, the Institute for Holiness, Kehilat Mussar Mindfulness. You are welcoming us today in Israel. The hour is around 12:45 in the afternoon on Sunday, December 1st, 2024. Normally, I record this right after Shabbat, Motzei Shabbat, but Hashem had other plans for us, Motzei Shabbat. So if you are joining us live stream, welcome. If you're coming from west of Israel, then it is either very early on Sunday morning. If you're joining us east of Israel, then it's later on Sunday and perhaps into Monday. Either way, welcome. This is concerning Shabbat. The Parasha was Toledot. It was on November 30th, 2024. And the Hebrew date was Kaftet, the 29th of Cheshvan, the Hebrew month of Cheshvan, Tavshen Pei Hey, 5785 was the year, is the year. So you're obviously joining us on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, Chodesh Tov, which means welcome to the new moon of the month of the Hebrew month of Kislev. We enter this great month where we will be getting darker and darker, heading towards the 25th of Kislev, where we will enter the celebration of Chanukah, the Festival of Lights. So today is Aleph of Kislev, almost 100% sure. I'll double check that. Sometimes it ends up being Lamed, the 30th. Yeah, it is the 30th. Okay. So it's the 30th of Cheshvan, Lamed. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here with you. We are in the 6th Torah portion of the new year in the book of Bereshit, of the 5 books of Moses, known as the Hebrew Bible or the Torah. And it's Parshat Toledot. Delighted to be here. I'm feeling very full of hakarat hatov, of gratitude for this moment of arriving with you, creating this live streaming, whether you're joining us at our YouTube channel, please subscribe, Mussar Mindfulness, or live on Facebook. You can also see the recording of video on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you have social media, Instagram. And of course, you can always refer to our website of kehilatmussar.com. Go to the blog section and you will find both audio and visual, video. And of course, wherever you listen to your podcasts, you can find the podcast of the Institute for Holiness under Mussar Mindfulness. So we begin. This covers Toledot in the book of Genesis and Bereshit, chapter 25, verse 19, Yutet, through chapter 28, verse 9. This chapter in general among scholars is known as kind of where 2 nations emerge, which we'll get into. What does that mean? We'll begin with a summary as we usually do. And this year is quite special because we are not only looking at the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, where it teaches us 48 to 50 different ways to acquire Torah. We're also looking at our Mussar sages that we learn from, and really honing in on one master middah that really speaks to us about the Torah portion, that we can really learn from as part of our path, which is, I think, the intention of a tradition that specializes in and year out of visiting the same texts each Shabbat. There is a very profound, repetitive practice that allows you to dive in deep, to learn from our ancestors and God. What is it that I'm supposed to get out of this text? How am I supposed to see it in my life and apply it? So let's begin. The summary. Yitzhak, who is our second patriarch, he is the son of Avraham. He is now married to Rivka. As you might recall, she joins him in marriage. He was 40 years at the time. And now we're dealing with, when we entered Parasha Toledot, we're entering 20 years later. Big span. 20 years later. So this second series of patriarchal narratives, I would even call it matriarchal narratives, right? Relating to Yitzhak begins, really. This is now going to be his own story. And the data about him are exceedingly sparse. Let's just say, often in familial relationships, there is a parent who takes up a lot of space in relation to the children. That's not to say that we're passing judgment on that, but if we're going to label a parent as one taking up a lot of space with their own agenda, with their own relationship with God, with how they move in the world, that would be Avraham. To the point where Avraham, what it seems to be non-consensual, maybe consensual at the end, is taking his son to be sacrificed. Avraham, who, as far as the text is concerned, did not communicate with his wife and get her permission to take her only son, the only one she loved. And Hashem doesn't need to repeat those three things for her. Your son, your only son, the one that you love, as he does to Avraham, because Avraham also loved Yishmael. Sarah did not love Yishmael. So, as far as we know, Midrash will come later and say that he did tell Sarah and she did want the sacrifice. You can study all of this. He's a father that takes up a lot of psychic space. So much so that when Yitzhak is not sacrificed and leaves down the mountain, he leaves alone. They don't speak ever again. So this is his narrative. Much of what is preserved, his birth and his circumcision, the Akedah and his marriage, is all about Avraham, is all integrated into the biography of Avraham. It's about Avraham, what he needs to accomplish and get done regarding his son. Also, similarly, we will see next with the third patriarch, is there's much written about him, and many stories that we will come to see. Okay, so very sparse when it comes to Yitzhak. Nothing is actually recorded for the first 20 years of his marriage to Rivka. 20 years, no children. Only a few isolated events in his life are actually preserved in the literature, which essentially are clips by the towering figure, the one that takes up all the emotional, psychic, and physical space, even his berot, right? His wells are Abraham's wells. And they are essentially from the towering figure of his father, And obviously his own life later on, Yitzhak, is overshadowed by the dynamic, forceful personality of Yaakov, who will come at the end of this narrative. Okay? But that is not to say that Yitzhak is just this mere transition from Abraham and Yaakov. There are some real profound marks of individuality, and they are quiet. They're not the kind that people tell in stories. They're not remarkable. And they're the things that make up daily life, that when people are consistent like this, they are the most trustworthy. They are the most centered and foundational that you feel you can turn to, right? So his name, which is uniquely bestowed by God, by Hashem, is not changed. He doesn't go from some other name to Yitzhak, like Avram goes to Avraham, like Yaakov goes to Israel. His name is not changed. His pastoral wanderings actually are very restricted to a narrow range. He's not someone who moves around. And they're largely centered around Beersheba, which Be'er, right? He's the one who's I don't know what the word would be in English, uncovering, making useful again the wells of his father, which, Be'er Sheva means the 7 wells, right, which come up. And unlike Abraham, he does not actually live in Hebron, Kriyat Arba, but settles there only in his old age. He also alone is the only one who remains married to one woman. He remains monogamous. This is the first patriarchal role model of this type of relationship. He's the only one to engage in agriculture, and he actually is the only one never to leave the promised land. So these are all actually really quite significant. They're especially for women who are involved in the life of the patriarch and perhaps married to him. There's a certain trustworthiness, as I mentioned, but also a stability. There's a stability, there's a reliability. Maybe to the point where, based on Rivka's behavior in this Parasha, which we'll soon see, maybe the most challenging thing will be the repetitiveness and therefore sloth and torpor and boredom. She becomes so dramatic in her conniving that it seems theatrical. It seems like she's in need of some stimulation. So he actually has a unique divine name, a Pachad Yitzhak, that is told in chapter 31, verse 42. And it suggests, therefore, to talk about the fear of Yitzhak, right? It suggests that there was an episode that's not recorded in the Torah, but we cannot know. And it really is fear, pachad. Were it not enough, the akedat Yitzhak? I don't know. We just don't know. Also referred to later in Amos is the shrine of Yitzhak, the house of Yitzhak, right? So there's some more meaning about him out there in our tradition that we're just not inheriting. Okay, so he prays. This is the first patriarch also to pray for his wife. He prays for Rivka to have children. She becomes pregnant with twins. The twins struggle inside her. The very verb is that they are clashing and banging into one another, right? God tells her that this is because there are 2 nations within her, which already is very interesting, because why can't 2 nations live together without clashing? But maybe this is to teach us some insight into accepting human limitation and behavior, that 2 nations actually cannot live together, and especially in such a small enclosed space. The firstborn is reddish and covered with hair, and they call him Esav. The secondborn is holding on to Esav's heel, and they call him Yaakov, which has the same shorish, the same root of Leakov, and also Ekev, heel, okay, to follow after. Yitzhak loves Esav. It actually says this in the text. Loves him because of the game, the food that he brings to his mouth, essentially. Rivka loves Yaakov. We're not told why. Already that should send signals to you, like, why are we being told about parental love? First of all, it's only the second time that we're even seeing the verb love. The first one was in relation to Yitzhak, when he encounters and marries Rivka, that he is comforted by her and he loves her, right? I think it says love. So now we have where they are loving one child and not the other. Years later, Yaakov, as a teenager, 17 years old, seemingly buys, I would use different language, and it's a form of coercion. I can't think of the term right now. Buys the birthright, the special responsibilities and privileges of the firstborn from Esav when he is starving, when he comes back from hunting, hasn't eaten or drinking in days. He's actually so hungry and parched, okay, at the point of death. And Yaakov refuses to feed him from the lentils, the stew that he's making, until he sells his birthright, gives him his birthright. Okay, this is done under duress, and there are no witnesses. So it's kind of surprising that this is even held up at all. That's a whole nother issue. Already, this should sound like one tragedy after another that stems from the very beginning. Perhaps that they were at war with one another in the womb. Perhaps that God has set up two Jewish children, both born from Jewish parents, Yitzhak and Rivka, where one child is going to essentially be rejected from the covenant. And yes, he'll be his own nation, his own people, but he's no longer part of the Jewish people. That should tell you something already, that the problem begins with God's either choice or understanding, predestination, whatever you want to call it, of causing two different nations within the womb of the Jewish woman. Then obviously there should be a problem that the parents are loving one child over the other. You could see the train wreck coming, right? And then Yaakov manipulates his brother. That's where things stand. Yitzhak in old age goes blind, and he tells Esav that he's going to give him a bracha. It's time for him to receive his blessing before the father's going to pass away. Rivka hears this because she's obviously someone who's always, she's now essentially the master of the house because she has this infirmed husband who is about to die, is going blind. She is essentially taking over the house as much as she's able to within a patriarchal culture. She obviously cannot take over to the point of giving blessings, of assigning birthright to one son over the other. Things have to be done in a conniving, manipulative, hidden way. So she's always got an ear out. So she hears this and she wants Yaakov to receive the blessing, the one that she loves and favors. She tells Yaakov to wear Esav's clothing, put goat skins on his arms so that he'll feel like hairy Esav. Yaakov then goes to get the bracha from Yitzhak. Okay, so talk about putting a stumbling block before the blind. This is someone who is entering in and lying to a blind, dying father, and even evokes God's name. and while lying. Okay, we'll hold that. Yitzhak notices that his son sounds like Yaakov, but has the hairy hands of Esav. And Yitzhak gives him the bracha, gives him the blessing. And when Esav finds out, 17-year-old Esav finds out what happened, total reptilian animal brain takes over, right? And he is so upset. He is sobbing and crying out, mixture of powerlessness and violation and shame and anger and rage and everything in between. And he says that he will kill Yaakov when his father passes away. Rivka, the mother, hears that what Esav is planning to do, and she, through again manipulating with Yitzhak, tells Yaakov that it's time for him to leave, to flee, and he is to go to her brother's house, Lavan, and remain there until she says that Esav's anger calms down, which either it never calms down, or not so much she forgot, but she gets caught up in daily life. Maybe she even hears that he's starting to work for Lavan and needs to stay up there. Maybe she hears that he's married 2 women already. Who knows? But he doesn't return, and he never sees his mother again after this. So as much as she did this to keep her son alive, there will be no benefit on her part of being in a relationship with him after this. So that's the background. Immediately, you might be thinking, what is the master middah? The soul trait, the personality trait that we talk about in Mussar of cultivating. We believe that we have an interior world that is made of all the midot, all the character traits of the human being. We all have them. And that we seek on the path to balance our character traits that are balanced for us. Excuse me. So it's pretty obvious that one of the central midot, of course, we could pick many, is the idea of falsehood, which falls under truth, the opposite of truth, right? So it's falsehood. The truth is emet, the lack of emet, emet. And what ties to when there's a lack of truth, when there's falsehood, is a lack of trustworthiness. A lack of truthness is a lack of trustworthiness. Nobody feels they can trust someone that they don't feel is honest. So this is all, so maybe 2 sides of the same coin. Okay. What I'm going to delve in with first is to talk about this a little, bring what I have to share with you so that we can see what else we want to get from this. All right. Now, something unique happens. I don't know how much it's unique as it is a phenomenon. The Jewish people are an ancient people, so much so, probably at least 4,000 years old. And when you are part of an ancestral, of an ancient people, right? First Nation people, you have a very rich history. So that means you probably have gone through many experiences and in some ways gained certain wisdom that maybe peoples who are not as old, lived, experienced, haven't gone through. So why do I start this this conversation this way? Is that the Jews, our ancestors, went through a period with Rome. When Rome was at the height of the Roman Empire, there was a comic once in the United States. I'm not going to be able to quote his name, He's another Jew, I believe. He says the Roman Empire is neither Rome nor an empire. Please discuss. I remember that. I think it comes from Saturday Night Live. But this is to say that when you're an ancient people, you've moved through many colonistic empires who took over your land over time. And somehow, with God's help, the Jewish people survived this, right? So when you survive this and you witness it, and sometimes you're kidnapped, and sometimes you're taken from the land, sometimes you're murdered. It's horrible. There are horrible parts of being colonized by another empire. But when the Roman Empire takes over and converts to Christianity, it's pretty brutal. If you don't know the history, you can look into it and study it. But basically, it's one that is highly antagonistic towards the Jews, towards anyone who will not fall under the fold of Christianity, of the Roman Empire. And our rabbis, our commentators, our sages, who are essentially writing their commentary on the Torah, begin to associate Esav, who's going to become another nation, with Edom. And Edom gets associated with Rome. And that's not a positive thing. So if you look through the rabbinic writing, you will find over and over again that Esav is characterized in very negative terms, identified with Christianity, identified and characterized Christianity negatively, right? Modern day viewers who aren't taught how to history and to read things from a distance without reactivity will be very uncomfortable by reading some of the rabbinic commentary. And they will, some of the views will appear as dangerous, prejudice, right? To read a minority people who are so reactive and angry towards the ruling empire. And it's very important for us to understand the historical context with which the traditional commentaries are written. What you'll find in what we call the Mikraot Gedolot, the classical commentaries around the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. And these traditional commentaries are written in a period when Jewish people are being persecuted under Roman and Christian rule. And the writers, the commentators, like one we'll address soon, essentially express their Jewish frustration and anger over the Christian oppression. The Crusades were happening. And in those times, Christianity espoused very negative views about Judaism. And even though today we feel that we have greater objectivity and tolerance, some pockets, some circles, and that we attempt to have interfaith dialogue, the views towards both Judaism and Christianity towards one another have changed today, but very difficult back then. Okay. So why do I give you this context? Why is this important? Because if we're going to talk about truth and falsehood, all of a sudden you're going to run into the commentaries. And in particular, I'm thinking I'll start with the master commentator, Rashi from France, right? So Rashi comes along and others, and they perpetuate a falsehood about Esav. They basically see him as either to the extreme of evil, someone who spurned the birthright, someone who has no respect for the institutions of patriarchy of the father, giving to the firstborn the double portion of the birthright and blessing the child, having many really negative commentary about him, and he goes on. So Rashi basically also comes to perpetuate this negative view about him. it's almost like they have to find something wrong with him and his behavior. And not only that, they epitomize it. They make it into about a people, and that's a people that he comes from. So it's not just about one individual. And there's very little, I shouldn't say no, very little compassion or understanding that this is a 17-year-old boy who probably is very impulsive, very choleric, given that he loves to be out and hunting in the field. There's no attempt to even give the benefit of the doubt or understand him. So when you see this, you must begin to ask yourself in this Torah portion, why did they set out to perpetuate this falsehood, right? And why must this narrative be created and perpetuated at all? And a very important question that we could even really should look at today is what might be lost by not being honest and seeing clearly, seeing much more fairly and with complexity who Esav is, who Yaakov is, and how they all behave. Okay, so we have some understanding. We're giving the Jews benefit of the doubt that they were an oppressed minority, were totally persecuted by the Roman Christian Empire. So you have the rabbis, of course, delving into the text to relate to it to their day, to understand certain people are larger metaphors for nations. It's how we really understood people a lot, is that they were a father of a nation. And so what their midot were and how they behaved and related to the world will we either see in or project onto the nation, the people that they will become. Okay. So, but you have to just understand that the very falsehood, the very lack of trustworthiness that starts to happen in this Torah portion with Yaakov's behavior, first towards his brother by starving him until he gives the birthright, and then with the mother Rivka lying and manipulating to fool her husband to give the bracha, the blessing, and then 17-year-old Yaakov, again in really reptilian brain, also having deep kavod and respect for the mother, which is institutional, decides to go along, if there is any consent in this at all, with what she has commanded him, that he is to get up, get dressed like Esav, wear the goat skin, and go in and pretend he's Esav. A horrifying moment, right? So that then is another lack of trustworthiness. It's a falsehood. So you see this, like, in some sense, today we might have a lot of judgment and find the behavior horrific. That people are willing, what it seems on the outside, to do something for personal gain, right? Like how could they behave that way? How could we record it and pass it on? How could we as a people choose to see the behavior completely differently? Choose to see the behavior of Yaakov and Rivka as holy, as upright, as the right thing to do. Now, here and there, you do have some people who recognize and are deeply uncomfortable with it. But overall, there's this sense of Rivka, for instance, if we're going to move through how this happens, right? That the truth, there's this idea that truth, emet, there's another layer of truth that's hidden from us. Not everyone knows the full picture and story, which is true for the human being. And she's given insider knowledge in the sense that God has told her that when she is carrying the twins, that there are two nations within her, and that one shall inherit her people and passing on, and that's going to be Yaakov, right? So the way it gets read is that she had this insider truth, and she acts in accordance with God's will because this is what God wanted, and she acts in accordance with it. Okay. There's a big difference between knowing the insider view and the truth that God has shown you, and then deciding to move in your own free will to cause it to happen. So that's one. Two, the idea that something is still deceptive, and that deception comes with consequences, even when it's commanded by God, or even when the insider truth, the higher layer truth, compels you to think that you're right and that you are to behave this way. One of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite Torah teachers, I taught from her all last year, Nechama Lebowitz. Although she deeply values and loves, holds really great reverence, yira, and kavod, honor for our ancestors, comes to say in her commentary that sin and deceit, which is how she views Rivka's behavior and Yaakov's, however justified, bring their train in ultimate punishment. That's pretty intense to admit and see that there's karma, there are consequences for behavior, even when it's justified, even when you think you're right, you know the truth, and even when God commands it. That's a hard pill to swallow. So if you're having a hard time hearing that as a particularly religious observant Jew, I know that I have a hard time. It's the nature of the world as it is. Maybe God intended to. Just think back to the story of Akedat Yitzhak, right? It is clear that God commanded Abraham to take Yitzhak and to sacrifice him. We're told, we have insider knowledge, we have a greater truth, we as the audience reading or knowing or hearing the story, that this is a trial. He still commands him. We don't think Abraham knows that. He doesn't have that insider knowledge. Maybe he does. We don't know. It's clear in the text that he doesn't. It's commanded by God to sacrifice his child, his son, his only son, the one he loves. It's not justified, right? It's justified because it's commanded by God, and there's consequences for that behavior, even so. Consequences whether he actually really did sacrifice Yitzhak, which according to Jewish tradition, he did not. And then consequences that he didn't, and that he replaced it with the ram, which is they never speak again. Yitzhak, Yaakov. No, not Yaakov, excuse me. Abraham and Yitzhak. God never speaks to Abraham again. Yitzhak's own Ima, his mother, dies. He never gets to see her again. There are consequences, even for things that are justified or commanded by God. So this is part of this idea of truth, of trustworthiness, deep, to be trustworthy. So it's not so much bitachon as in, because that as a middah means trust in God. It means, are you someone that's trustworthy through your truth, through you not living a falsehood? Okay, so it comes down to this. So we have to always keep this in mind that there is sometimes even no other way to live. This might be the nature of the human being, that we have to accept things as they are and not how we want them to be. So the final thing I will share on this is I obviously hold today, because I am not living and coming out of the Roman Christian Empire and being oppressed. I have the privilege and the blessing of distance from that I don't have to see Esav as representative of Edom, which is representative of Rome and Christianity, that I don't need to see him as part of the backdrop of duplicity, that he's an evil man, a wicked father of an adulterous and oppressive nation. None of us have to buy that, even though many of our commentators will follow that from that time, from that oppression. It'd be really interesting, actually, if some of the Torah were received now with new stories in the backdrop of jihadism, radical jihadists, of a domineering religion of over I think at least 2 billion people, if not more, who are seeking to colonize. They already have colonized many lands, but colonize more and take over more nations and people and land, and are willing to murder to do so, to commit genocide. So if we had that backdrop here of someone who came from us of two nations and it wasn't Roman Christianity, but instead it was Iranian jihadism, right? I can see how we would see that person as evil and epitomize that this is the nation. But we need to understand that we see it through that lens because that's what we inherited and been taught, right? I will say that when Rivka sends her son away in order to not be murdered by Esau because he cheated him, stole his birthright, and then his blessing, that she ends up in some ways causing him to be more like Esau, the very thing that she didn't want. She hated that Esau went ahead and married on his own, which is not something you did in the institution back then. You allowed your parents to pick your marriage partner. He went ahead and married two women. Let's see if I can remember their names, Yehudit and Basmat. And then realizing that they were hated by his parents, he goes ahead and marries a third woman, Machalat, which is coming from Machala, illness. He breaks lots of traditional rules that are not acceptable for someone who's going to inherit and be the father of the Jewish people, of a great nation of 12 tribes. So what happens when she sends Yaakov away? She unwittingly makes him more like Esau. He will end up selecting his own wives. A bit they are from her family. He will select them, not the parents. They're not Hittites, right? He will end up not being a man of the tents who is staying home with her cooking. He ends up being out in the field, less of a hunter, obviously, but more of a shepherd. And just similar things, that he will connive and lie to his father-in-law, Lavan, as you'll see later on in the next Torah portion of Vayitze, Vayishlach also. So I will say one thing more. The rabbis are obviously deeply uncomfortable even of their own bias, their own falsehood, where they will have to question, do the ends really justify the means? Which is a really difficult question. to ask when you know that Yaakov is supposed to be the father of the 12 tribes. When you have the privilege of hindsight, you can justify certain things. So there is, coming out of some Mussar teachings, this idea that first really deeply uncomfortable and questioning that did he have to defeat Esav? Did he really have to capture his birthright and blessing? And they do a sort of twist about it. They end up saying that the object of Yaakov's quest was actually not for his brother's defeat, that he was instead ensuring this higher truth of a fulfillment of a world historical mission, right? And it's not to prevent Esav from doing it, it's that Yaakov knew that he was the one destined for this divine mission. And though the birthright and the blessing really are in the end are instruments of a divine purpose that will help Yaakov and Yaakov alone make what is to become the hardest ethical decision for himself, which is essentially to associate and live among the corrupt and not become corrupted. Which means he lives with Lavan, as you will see, who is corrupt, and not become corrupted. I feel that that is a stretch. One, I'm not sure how much Yaakov at 17 really understood a world historical mission, even if his Ima talked his ear up about it, that he was to become this great nation. I also don't think that he probably had anything else in mind when getting the birthright. So it's a hard pill to swallow. I want to acknowledge it and to understand that for some of our commentators and ancestors, this is a way that they try to read it. That he's really not being corrupt, that he will have to sometimes use certain means that are really not the object of it. So it's almost like saying it wasn't his intent. And what do we love to say in 2024? Well, it's the impact of his behavior. Doesn't matter what his intention was in the end. The impact was what he did to Esav. The impact was what he did to his father, which is both deceitful and lying. The impact will be total isolation from his family for 20 years, that he has to flee, that he will be isolated and alone and end up in a corrupt, very difficult, if not evil man's house, that he will have to live a difficult, long life. One that's actually plagued by guilt and shame of his own behavior until he's able to reunite with Esav in adulthood. So this is what Nechama Leibowitz means when she says, sin and deceit, however justified, however commanded, however understood as a higher truth, bring in their train ultimate punishment. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it is the nature and truth of life, right? If we're going to behave this way. So few things I will close in with on this, and then I want us to teach in order to have some kind of compassion and a more nuanced reading of people who end up being trustworthy or not trustworthy, right? Why does Yitzhak favor Esav? It's not just about the food. That's what the Torah tells us. He liked the game that he made for him. Think about Yitzhak coming down that mountain with post-traumatic stress disorder from being almost sacrificed. which means either he wanted to be sacrificed and he wasn't, which would be traumatic, or he actually didn't want it and the whole thing was traumatic. Either way, the impact is that it's traumatic. He is drawn to the outer child. He is drawn to the child who would have fought. He is drawn to the child who is the hunter, who would have seen the ram, who would have demanded to know where is the sacrifice. He is drawn to the child that he wished and wanted to be, that he feels safe around, that he feels would save him, would hunt for him, would feed him, would care for him. And so Yitzhak gives all the benefit of the doubt. If there is anything that we might see as troublesome in Esav or his behavior, he saw the Nikudat Hashem in him. He saw the soul, he saw the potential of who he was. And that's even a Mussar practice, that we are to attempt to see the potential of the person, not just the soiled behavior. The difficulty with that is when you're later on told, which we are with Esav by the commentators, that you're only to see that soiled behavior. You're not supposed to see that he also is a child created in the image and likeness of the divine and has trustworthy behavior, upright behavior. So I will say that we do have one commentary coming on, I think it's out of Bereshit Rabbah, Midrash from Rambam Gamliel, the head, the Nasi, who helped redacted the Mishnah. He actually says that he has like a kavod and respect for Esav, and acknowledges that he doesn't even have 1/100th of the honor for his father, even though he cares for his father every single day of his life. He doesn't have 1/100th of the kavod that Esav had for Yitzhak. So he's able to see something. And I will even say that even in Esav's most difficult, trying moments of pain and suffering and anguish, powerlessness, shame, rage, when he finds out that his blessing has been stolen by Yitzhak, he never takes that rage out on his father. He never dishonors his Abba, Yitzhak. He never says, what? You couldn't tell the difference between us? You only have 2 sons. You're telling me you couldn't tell the difference? He never says that. He never, ever shows up on that. Maybe out of patriarchy, there's a fear to do that. It's so ingrained that you don't ever speak back to your father, that it's less kavod, it's less honor and more fear. Maybe the name should not be Pachad Yitzhak, but Pachad Esav. I don't know. But it doesn't come that way. Instead, his anger gets towards the responsible party, which is Yitzhak, right? Should also be towards Rivka, but that doesn't happen. This is a huge change from what will come with the 12 tribes, with the brothers who will blame Yosef, who is the favored, loved child of Yaakov. You think he would have learned from watching how his father Yitzhak behaved. The brothers hate and direct their hate and jealousy and shame and embarrassment and suffering and anguish towards Yosef, when really the object of that, the cause of it, is their father, it's Yaakov. And that's who they should have been directed against. But then that just shows you the strength of the patriarchy. Too dangerous to hate the patriarch, the father. There are consequences that we don't even get to see in the Torah, right? Okay, so which moves us to besides the middah, right, of trustworthiness and how we cultivate it, which means that we live a certain truth and we are honest and upright and show that truth. That we learn from the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot of the 48 to 50 ways of acquiring Torah, our sixth way of acquiring Torah, which is what we're going to move into next, which is yirah. Now, yirah gets often translated as fear in English, but it really has three meanings. It has fear, awe, and reverence. And the three actually go all together, but there is no equivalent word in English. So the Mishnah wants us to really understand that when we learn Torah, when we engage in certain cultivations and practices, it's often a project of the mind, but sometimes it's of the heart. In yirah, awe, fear, and reverence is really experience of the heart and has an ultimate power to transform. It's also very difficult to cultivate and practice, right? Often when we think of these things of reverence, fear, and awe, they're things that are external that we feel happen to us. And we either are aware of it in the moment that we're like, oh, this is experiencing yirah, or we have it in hindsight. We look back and go, oh, that was yirah, right? But however, that we begin to get some insights when the Torah tells us, in particular, a Mussar teacher, Rav Yerucham Levowitz, actually comes to say that that he feels that the environment in which the Torah was given on Har Sinai, with the mountain and the mountain shaking and the smoke and the lightning and the thunder, this kind of yirah-inducing phenomenon is not just a dramatic backdrop, but a necessary condition for hearing the words of Torah. That had that environment not been there, had there not been the thunder, the lightning, the mountain shaking, and the smoke, that our ancestors would not have heard, internalized, experienced in the heart the words of the Torah, that it required that environment. Now, he teaches this, of course, in his text, Da'at Chokhmah Mussar, Volume 2, Chapter 51 to 53. Obviously, we can attempt to seek out certain type of environments that we know will have embodied, full of all the senses experience, to see if we can engage in a way that will have us learn in the heart and not just the head. And that's very challenging to do, right? So a useful practice in acquiring Torah this way is one, to endeavor to find the spectacular, the awe-inducing, the fear-inducing, the reverence-inducing in everything, in mundane holiness, in the everyday life, not just in the shaking mountain with the thunder and the lightning and the smoke, but rather fixing ourselves on our immediate environment, bringing our full loving attention, mindfulness to the object, and really understanding what, with our limited understanding, the essence of the object and how truly remarkable it is, and that it exists at all, and that you're actually able to see it and analyze it and think about it and feel it and smell it and touch it and everything else related to it. This convergence, right, of realizing how miraculous this is, that you're having this encounter and this thing exists, is remarkable, is inconceivable, is the awesome. So this should be repeated as many times in one's daily life as possible, as one of the ways, the sixth way, that we acquire Torah. That there's something that our ancestors and God felt was so intrinsic in us encountering yirah in our daily encounters, being really awake to everything around us. As we say in Hakarat Tov, the middah of gratitude, which really translates into recognizing the good. I would just say recognizing, right? The ability that you are able to recognize in and of itself is a miracle and amazing. So that is the practice of acquiring Torah, and may we all be able to engage in such a thing, which ties to one of the key Mussar practices that we're going to move into now. Normally we engage in mindfulness meditation, which is one of the first Mussar practices of developing concentration, of training the mind, of essentially being able to develop space between the stimuli and the response, or as some like to say, space between the match and the fuse, coming from Rabbi Pear, wonderful, may his memory be for a blessing, wonderful Mussar teacher. But it really develops concentration and a clear focus mind to be able to see clearly, which is the second practice, right? So along with seeing clearly, we want to use mental images and contemplation to gain insight. And the key way that one of the key practices comes down to us from Rabbi Ibn Pekuda in Chovot Halevavot, the duties of the heart, 16th century text, I believe. He really feels that we should move through contemplating how we even came into being, and from that moment of that you were a zygote to who you are today, even to death. It really helps gain insight into the nature of the human being, the limitations of the human being, and therefore helps cultivate balance, humility, anava. So this is just one way in which Mussar uses mental images and contemplation. We're going to actually engage in it today in order to help cultivate truth, emet, the opposite of falsehood. In particular, that which cultivates within us and causes trustworthiness, that kind of truth, that kind of stability and showing up. So I invite you to assume your posture, whatever posture you normally assume for mindfulness meditation. It can be seated here in your chair, on a zafu, on a meditation cushion, standing in your upright pose, mountain pose, walking back and forth, but not walking anywhere particular, known as walking meditation. And then, of course, lying down. If you have any chronic pain or issues, lie down, relax, and keep your eyes open if you're lying down, because you want to remain awake and alert for the practice. You don't want to fall asleep. So the rest of us, I'm coming to the edge of my chair, of course, and I really want to fully arrive. So the way I invite this, talk about beginning with visualization, mental images of contemplation, is seeing yourself as your best friend, even if you have to fake it. Maybe you're not your own best friend right now. Really see yourself as your best friend standing before you, trustworthy, full of truth, and invite him or her fully here, or they, however you identify. Inviting fully here as you would a best friend. The head, the heart, the spirit, the soul, the body, everything fully here, heavy in the sit bones if you're seated. And we begin with a deep inhalation. And exhale. This time inhaling, lifting the shoulders. And exhale. This last one, inhalation. Allowing the exhale to be double the amount of time as the inhalation, to come to true ease and relaxing. No need to control your breath, allowing it to fall to its own natural rhythm. We're going to begin with reflecting on how generous God Hashem has been to us by bringing into our lives those who were upright, that we could trust, that helped us cultivate trustworthiness, who really expected and wanted the best of us, who we could count on for truth and their truth, who never did the opposite, where they made us feel unsafe, a falsehood, sense of not feeling that we had a foundation underneath us. They did the opposite. They built a very strong foundation, taught us that we could trust them and we could trust the world. And if you don't have anyone like this in your life, and you never have, I want you to imagine who that person would be, what it would be like. See them fully in front of you. Maybe you feel it's you and you can see yourself slowly over time. Maybe it's God who has taken that role for you. Inviting to close the eyes if you feel safe and comfortable, otherwise lowering your gaze. So you have before you the person who provided nourishment, protected, helped you grow and develop. This amazing, mysterious process where we, over time, come to know someone and through them know ourselves. Fully seeing that person or people in front of you. Could be a parent, your grandparents, a sibling, could be a neighbor, a coach, a teacher, could be a doctor, could be a friend. Anytime we excel, we stumble and fall, we laugh, we cry, that person happened to be there, solid, loyal, honoring us, honoring our shared life. And we see all this before us. Knowing that someday we can envision that Hashem, that God, that the divine being of all the universe will declare our return someday. Left collateral with us, left this angel to guide us, And either that person will be expected to return before us, or we will. This is the cycle that's been given to us. We see the vastness of this trust, of this trustworthiness. Awakening in us an accurate and honest insight into the nature of beautiful, grounded relationships, that they are ephemeral, they will pass, that they and we will eventually return to our Maker. And that doesn't undo our experience of the relationship, our experience of being with them. The wonder of life is before us, eyes open, awake and alert, awake to this profound truth that we are to be fully present in the moment to experience the trust and the truth that come at us. The trust and the truth that seek to cultivate within us that we too be trustworthy, that we show up, that we be counted on. Trusting that if we contemplate and see this image and these images clearly enough over time, that as a spiritual discipline, they will penetrate deeply enough, they will become inscribed in the soul. We will enter 1 minute of silence before I ring the bells to pull us out of the meditation. If your eyes are closed, gently and slowly open them, allowing the light to filter in without shocking you, especially if you're joining us on this Zoom live streaming video. If it's your practice to bow, please do so to the Almighty, to God, to our ancestors, to passing down these teachings, taking refuge in the teachings, taking refuge in our teachers, taking refuge in the Institute for Holiness and our great community, to support one another, to strengthen these teachings as we investigate and try them out. What a gift. That we take refuge in God and the wisdom of these ancient ancestral traditions of Mussar in the Jewish tradition, and mindfulness coming out of Theravada Buddhism, of the Dharma, the Eightfold Path. So much to communicate and be in dialogue over these wonderful traditions that guide us today. So thank you. Thank you for arriving and coming to Toledot, a very difficult Torah portion, in my opinion. We will meet Motzei Shabbat, after Shabbat, for Vayetze, Bezrat Hashem, God willing. Today's gathering and public offering is actually sponsored by my dear Ima, who will soon be passing. And we're all holding her very deeply. The Institute for Holiness is dear to her in this whole lifelong project of being on the path together. Always been very supportive of the vision and the leadership to make this happen. And so we're grateful for her sponsorship and for all of you that find her dear and love her and know that you've been praying for her, and she is not in pain. And we can all be grateful that she is returning to her maker soon, and to all of our relatives who are waiting for her to return to the ancestors. So as hard and sad that is, as you know, she's lived a very long life, and blessed to have that hakarat tov, that awakening to the good that is before us, as sad and trying as it is to lose someone that you love. So thank you for all of you for your support. We conclude today, and I look forward to learning and practicing next week. Do reach out. After reading Vayetze, do find the poll on, for instance, Spotify's poll on the podcast and vote what you think the master middah of the next Torah portion is. Do reach out if you are a member of the Institute of Holiness to give your opinion of what the master middah is, because it helps us determine what this curriculum is going to be. What are we going to talk about and share? So I thank you for your participation. I wish you all Chodesh Tov, a happy month of Kislev, and for all that celebrated, happy Sigd, right? The wonderful Jewish Ethiopian festival that just passed yesterday. Very grateful to Hashem for all that we have, as difficult as it has been. And of course, holding all the survivors, the genocide of October 7th, and the hostages who still remain, now 422 days. So really holding all this, and that sharing in that forbearance and that burden, right? That what we call savlanut. Holding each other, strengthening each other, taking it one day at a time. Thank you. Wishing you all the best.